Hi everyone, Dr. Arthur Plesa here, founder of Knee Chest Specific Chiropractic Certification Seminars.
Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Jackson, instructor for knee chest specific chiropractic certification seminars.
Fantastic. So the purpose of this video is to provide a historical review for the different contact points used when adjusting Atlas. So we're going to take you guys from D.D. Palmer all the way to B.J. Palmer. So that's 1895 all the way to 1961.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's super important that we understand that there was like a definite progression and a development in the art of chiropractic. BJ Palmer refined chiropractic adjusting techniques all the way from full spine to upper cervical, and he modified how to adjust the atlas, which contact point was determined to be the best, based on the neurokilometer and everything that came along with that.
Yes, wonderful. So let's go ahead and get started then. We're going to begin with D.D. Palmer, the discoverer of chiropractic. Dr. Jackson, can you let us know from your references what were some of the earliest mentions of Atlas adjusting and what contact points did D.D. Palmer use?
Yeah, so most people know that the 1910 book was the first book that Dee wrote. Obviously, he did write stuff before that, but if we sort of focus on his book, the main references in there about adjusting Atlas and that are relevant to this conversation about the contact point,
Mm-hmm.
um, there are about five references altogether between his 1910 book and his 1914 book.
Yes.
So if we start in the 1910 book, if I read one from page 131 now, he says, "We soon learned that the tissue over the spinous processes of the atlas became very tender. We now adjust on the posterior arch." So this first quote already shows an evolution because he says, "We now adjust on the posterior arch." So that
Mm-hmm.
means he changed it based on the tissue over the spinous processes of the atlas becoming tender. And I know that sounds weird to us because we know that the atlas
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have a spinous process. So yeah, the quote's a bit strange, but regardless of that, it's showing that Didi has come to adjust the atlas using the posterior arch.
Yes.
Um, there's three other quotes that
Mm-hmm.
come from the 1910 book. So if I go through them, they're quite short. He says 3/16 of an inch displacement of the atlas to the left or the right, which I have corrected hundreds of times by giving the thrust on either side of the posterior arch, relieving the tension. So that's page 198. And then on page 578, he says, in adjusting the atlas, do so by striking it on the right or the left side of the posterior arch, depending upon the direction you wish to move it. Then on page 881, he says, we use the spinous processes as levers in the lumbar, dorsal, and cervical, and the
Mm-hmm.
anterior ends of the posterior arch of the atlas when adjusting. Um, then there's one more in the 1910. He says vertiginous, affected with vertigo, giddy, dizzy, swimming of the head. He says look to the atlas. Adjust by using the phalangeal joint of the small finger as a knuckle, striking the posterior arch midway between the tubercle and the lateral mass. So that's page 969. That's all he says about it in 1910. In
Mm-hmm.
1914, there's even less, but he says a displaced atlas can be easily replaced by giving the thrust against the posterior arch. That's page 93 of his 1914 book, The Chiropractor. So yeah, that's everything that he says in his two books about the contact point of atlas.
Yeah, so what I found interesting, one point I want to bring up, especially to some of the new students right now that are going through school, um, D.D. Palmer and B.J. Palmer use different anatomy books than we are using in today's Gray's Anatomy, so to speak. One common that I think B.J. referenced back in his day was Dorland's medical anatomy book. I'm not sure if that's what D.D. was basing his off of, but that's an interesting point I want to bring up, a little of a side tangent here. He says something about Atlas having a spinous process. Now we know there's no spinous process there, but rather that posterior tubercle, I believe, is even mentioned in today's some anatomy books, like it's a diminished spinous. So just for the students listening, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, Didi did know his anatomy. He knew there's no spinous process on Atlas. It's just some anatomy text back then might have referred to it as a diminished spinous, but nonetheless, he's talking about the posterior tubercle there. Back to list contact points, we see here that pretty much he was using a posterior arch contact point. Is that correct? Yeah. And one of the hand contact points that Didi was using, we'll notice is not even the pisiform like BJ moved into later, but more of like a soft or fleshy pisiform, as we now call it. He says somewhere where the fifth metacarpal meets with the phalangeal joint. So kind of like this area right around here is where I'm imagining he's using it. So we're definitely seeing the beginnings of Atlas adjusting here, of where it started, and what Didi was doing with it. So now that we've got the first Atlas adjusting and contact points taken care of, let's go ahead and move into B.J. Palmer now. So I believe his earliest reference was back in 1908 in that green book. Dr. Jackson, would you go ahead and detail that for us and just mention some of the references that BJ has in there and how he was adjusting Atlas?
Yeah, sure. Again, I mean, like the relevant green book quotes that have to do with actually, adjusting contact points. Obviously, BJ's probably written before about the Atlas in general, but relevant to this conversation, in the 1908 book, The Science of Chiropractic, its Philosophy and Principles of Chiropractic Adjustments, on page 68, he writes, locate the spinous process of the axis and transverse process of the atlas, bisect this space, and the center point close to the skull will prove that underneath is the junction line of the lateral and posterior portions of the lamina of the atlas. The peculiar position of the adjusting of laminae makes it an object to shift. On our nail hand, the point of the nail to the center of the fifth carpal bone, which is placed in direct contact over the place previously palpated, which he's talking about the posterior arch there.
Yes.
In the same 1908 book, and in fact, is the next paragraph, BJ writes about also using the transverse process. So he says, in adjusting the transverse process, the heel or nail point can be used quite effectively, providing the hand and forearm be crotched into that place. But I prefer the first position, that is, closing the hand and placing the corner made by the articulation of the fifth metacarpal with the phalanges. This being placed upon the transverse is very effective, from which Atlas can be adjusted in any of the 6 directions upon which are based all movements. So that's also page 68.
Wonderful. So that right there is letting us know that there was definitely 2 contact points being used as of that point, from the transverse to the posterior arch of Atlas. What again I want to point out to the students, especially the new ones listening right now, is the antiquated term for posterior arch they were using then was the lamina. So very similar, like C2, C3, further on down have a lamina. They were calling the posterior arch at that point the lamina. So if you guys hear that in today's recording or read that in BJ's old work, just know that he is talking about the posterior arch. So the contact points that we're talking about then were definitely the posterior arch, which he was saying making with a fleshy pisiform contact, very similar to the way it's taught now. So right around this point here. Whereas the transverse, he's saying go back to over here, the heel or the actual pisiform of the hand at that point. So we are roughly about 1908 right now, about 10 plus years into chiropractic. And it looks like BJ, at least, is going in between both contact points, from the transverse to the posterior arch, with really not much specified reason as towards going which one contact or the other. So let's go ahead and take us now into the year of 1927. This is going to be our next historical landmark. Now, the writing that was done then was called The Art of Chiropractic, written by Stevenson. And there were actually 2 editions written. The first one being in 1927, and then the follow-up 20 years later in 1947. Dr. Jackson, would you please give us the details on those 2 editions, please?
So in 1927 edition, Stevenson describes the laminae, or more accurately, the posterior arch of the atlas, as a contact point for atlas adjustment. So page 21 of the book, Stevenson writes, the contacts for adjusting the atlas are on the laminae. The laminae of the atlas, or rather the structures corresponding to laminae, are the lateral posterior portions of the posterior arch. These are not laminae at all, being round instead of plate-like. The contact spots are on the side of laterality of the subluxation. So then there was a revised edition of this. So this is after Stevenson unfortunately died. It was revised by W.H. Quigley, and it had been updated to reflect the current thinking of the time, which is obviously post 1934. So we'd had the advent of upper cervical specific work. So if I go from the 1947 edition and give you the quote from that one, these are a little bit longer, but it says, in adjusting atlas subluxation, the transverse process is ordinarily selected as the contact point. However, the transverse process is sometimes recessed, preventing both palpation and contacting. In these cases, two alternative contact points can be used. One is just posterior to the root of the transverse process against the lateral mass of atlas, and the other is upon the posterior arch of atlas. And then it's
Okay, so we have now taken you guys from 1895 through the 1920s, and we see what D.D. Palmer and B.J. Palmer were both using. What started off as transverse and posterior arch contacts, you can see as of the 1920s was slowly beginning to switch over. So now we're going to take you guys to the beginning of the upper cervical era. This is phase 1 of upper cervical specific research by BJ. This now takes us into 1930 through 1933. So this is actually the opening chapter, as you can see, of volume 18, where BJ puts out the feelers, if you will, to the chiropractic community that there's a new chiropractic technique in town, HIO, or hole-in-one, as you may read. And what BJ was trying to understand was it possible that the only location a subluxation could exist was in the upper cervical spine? And if so, what was the ideal contact point to use? Or could you still use both contact points as was being done in the full spine era? So 1930 through 1933, thousands of chiropractors from all over the country were sending in cases to BJ of how upper cervical adjusting was improving by doing those adjustments exclusively. In 1934, BJ published a lot of that in volume 18, the subluxation specific, the adjustment specific. So this really becomes the first book, especially within the Green Book series, where the upper cervical specific work is being introduced and detailed to chiropractors. Dr. Jackson, would you just give us a quick rundown on volume 18? I know it's a massive book, so as quickly as you can, but most importantly, what was the contact point used when upper cervical specific officially began?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, this is the true introduction now of the upper specific work. BJ was transitioning from the full spine adjusting to exclusive upper cervical work. The first upper cervical technique was knee, chest, solid headpiece adjusting. Neurocalorimeter was being used to determine the subluxation being actually present. X-ray was determining the direction of the misalignment, and then they were doing pre and post instrumentation and X-ray to prove that the neurological and the structural changes had occurred due to solely adjusting the atlas or the axis. In volume 18, every mention of BJ adjusting is on the transverse process. There is zero references to the posterior arch or posterior ring, whatever you want to call it, as a contact point for adjusting the atlas. So there are far too many references for me to just go through reading them. I'd be reading to you for hours. But if you do a simple search in volume 18 for transverse process, you will find loads of them. I'll read at least one or two here that I think make the point. So this one, page 432. Also, checking chiropractors in their adjusting work, we find they usually place nail point 2 on lamina of atlas somewhere between the transverse process and the posterior tubercle of posterior arch of atlas. And then in capitals this is, I know of no more particular detail to efficient, correct, accurate, and honest work than can be portrayed right here in the question of contact. And then in page 437, he says, in both instances, the nail hand must be up on cutting edge. The nail hand cannot carelessly lie flat on the neck. Neither can nail point number 2 be used. Neither can nail point number 1 or nail point number 2 be placed so as to lie in, on, or somewhere around the transverse process of atlas, or in, on, or somewhere around the spinous process of axis, or in, on, or somewhere around the lamina of atlas or lamina of axis. The day of somewhere in, on, or around is gone if one finds it necessary to untorque a torqued subluxation. So I think, it's pretty clear. He's saying you need to be on the transverse process here.
That's very clear to me as well, Dr. Jackson. Even though that was written almost 100 years ago, all the way in, middle of Davenport, I read that quite clearly here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm sure in Bournemouth, England, you hear that quite clearly as well. It doesn't get much more clearer than that. So just to wrap up, what Dr. Jackson here was saying was that as of 1934, when upper cervical officially began, on paper, we have that BJ was very specific. It is a transverse process contact. And he very so eloquently puts it that we even move away from the lamina or the posterior arch, so much that we don't want to even use this contact anymore, the fleshy pisiform. the term you hear him using is the cutting edge. So meaning that high arch pisiform straight with the pisiform bone contact there. And I like what he says. We're not in, around, or near the transverse process contact, but rather right on it. And what this insinuates is the fact that you can accurately palpate it if you have good palpation skills. And this is something that the Palmer School taught and is still continued today, that if you can properly palpate that, which you should be able to, you can get a good contact on that transverse process. So let's go ahead and move in forward now a little bit more. We're done with the first phase of upper cervical research era, and we now move into what's called phase 2. This begins in 1935 with the inauguration of the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this point in our history, I just want to kind of brief up on it just to get you guys up to speed on what's going on here. So in 1935, B.J. Palmer started the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic, which was a 2-facility clinic, really the first of its kind that on one side had a full staff medical clinic, 2 medical doctors on staff with the leading cutting-edge medical instrumentation of its time. Now, on the opposite side was the chiropractic clinic. This is where patients received a full spine neurocoulometer scan, as well as x-rays. So what this did was it confirmed medically that, yes, there was something going on with the patient. The reason this was done was that prior to that time, medical doctors were saying that patients who were going to see chiropractors were hysterical. That's right. They actually didn't have any problems other than the ones in their head. And that the chiropractor somehow through psychology convinced them that they had something, adjusted them, and then their problem, psychologically went away. So I love in volume 25, BJ says, when we started the research clinic, we went scientific with a vengeance. Just to kind of hit the point home. So let's go to move into the second phase of upper cervical research era. This is going to take us from 1935 through about 1941. Dr. Jackson, would you touch base on that time period and especially touch base on the 1941 Council Bulletin, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is a bit difficult. This is harder to pin down. We know that in the BJ Palmer chiropractic clinic, they had knee chest tables, they had side posture tables. They were maybe using both, I guess so, because they were there. But at some point, BJ moves away from the knee chest posture a little bit, and he goes, well, actually more than a little bit. He likes the side posture, solid headpiece. That's what he moves to. When exactly that happens, it's a detail that's difficult to track down. He certainly states in 1950 that his preference is like the side posture technique. So we know that that's where he moved to. Now, that even when he does that, he does not waver from the transverse process contact. That's just one of those things that are steadfast all the way through from the 1934 bit we've gone through. So there is a quote here that I've got that's taken from the Council Bulletin in 1941. It's from part 4 of a series called How to Handle Over-Adjusted Cases. It's Vic Coxon's name that's attributed to it. He was an assistant director of the clinic at a certain time there. He says, I find a good many chiropractors are not thoroughly familiar with where to take contact for posterior or anterior rotation. Some say we take contact on the posterior ring of atlas if it is posterior. Some say on the lateral mass, but both such contacts are not correct. In the BJPCC, we do not at any time adjust the atlas on the posterior ring or the lateral mass. It is always on the transverse process. Axis is always adjusted on the spinous process. No contacts other than these are used because through experience in the past, we find these best. That's from the Council Bulletin, 1941.
Interesting. So for those who don't know, fill us in. What exactly is the Council? What is this whole bulletin thing about?
So I think it's a precursor to like notes from the clinic desk, which was something that the research center or the BJPCC sent out, trying to was some sort of like standardize things. So I think it actually was something like the Palmer Standardized Council or something like that. So they were just trying to eliminate variables within the clinic itself, which is great. It's slipping and checking, isn't it? So they're just checking that nothing is slipping through the cracks. And obviously, I guess maybe that was because why would he need to write something like this to, in capitals, in bold, saying it's always on the transverse process and both such contacts are not correct? So,
Yes.
yeah, that's a really interesting find, that one.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, with the fact that this council bulletin was, in a sense, trying to establish the standards of this new upper cervical research thing going on right now, it's pretty clear to me as well that, especially when you put things in all capitals, just like today, it means pay attention to this. This is something important. Interesting. So right now we are in the early 1940s of upper cervical chiropractic development. Let's go on and fast forward now to the year 1950. This is one of my favorite green books, volume 24, Fight to Climb. Now, the reason I love this one so much is that, like a lot of upper cervical chiropractors I've talked with, one of the one person we all want to be able to chat with is BJ Palmer. And what I love about this book in specific is that it actually has a questions and answers session where students are asking BJ Palmer questions they have. They've completed technique courses through the PSC. They've been through it all. Now they want to ask BJ directly questions. And what I find interesting is that almost every question I've had has been answered in this Q&A session right here. So it goes to show there's nothing new under the sun, and chiropractic students and chiropractors have been thinking about this, since BJ's time. So Dr. Jackson, go ahead and take us a little bit through volume 24 over there and some of the Q&A that BJ answers in specific towards contact points of Atlas, please.
Sure. So on page 408, question 160 is, how would you adjust an anterior atlas if transverses are obscured by low mastoids? Can it be done on side posture table? The answer from BJ is yes. We have yet to find any atlas subluxation we could not adjust from and on transverse process. Second quote. This is from page 430 to 431. Question 222 is, anterior rotation is always opposite the pivot point of an atlas pivot. Therefore, regardless of laterality and taking all things into consideration mechanically and chiropractically, would it be advisable for a person to administer his thrust on anterior transverse if it can be contacted? Example, ASRP, pivot on right transverse, so adjust anterior on left. Now, BJ's answer is, simple language is advisable. Questions often involve unusual and not used terms. Let us restate question and make simple sense out of what is desired to be known. A side slip is either left or right. Following that, it goes anterior or posterior and superior on side to which it is side slipped. We cannot disregard laterality. It is primary. Adjustment should be given capitals on transverse process of side of laterality. If it is left, then upon left transverse of atlas. So again, quite clear, and with the capitals as well.
Yes. So
There's one more here.
yes, please go ahead.
One more, question 277. In many cases, the tip of transverse of atlas is located between mastoid and jaw in such a way that is quite readily palpated, but very difficult or impossible to contact clearly with pisiform without at the same time contacting mastoid, jaw, or both. What do you do in these cases? Is there any objection to contacting the transverse with the chiropractic index finger and executing a toggle in this manner as for babies? The answer here from BJ is, there is no objection to doing what you suggest, but if there is a better way, we are justified doing it the better way. By so doing, we get quicker results on worse cases. We have yet to see atlas subluxation that we could not adjust on transverse process. It is so easy to alibi shortcomings and so difficult to perfect our technique to doing right things right way at right time. And then he says, see all these other answers that I've given. And that's page 455.
That's wonderful. So again, I love the fact that BJ included this question and answer session between the students and himself, because it really goes to show the mentality of where students were then. We're really no different now. We're really asking the same questions. So again, volume 24, for those of you who want to reference that, it is an awesome book. You're going to have a lot of your questions answered just from the student questions right there. So now we've taken you guys through 1950. Now what I want to do is I want to answer a question that comes from a particular knee chest groups that say, well, BJ Palmer used a posterior arch contact after the research clinic years. So first off, I want to address this, that it's a very anachronistic statement. The research clinic years never ended until BJ Palmer died. So they began in 1935 and went all the way until his death when the research clinic closed in 1961. Now, some within the knee chest community say that the research clinic ended, or the years ended in 1951 with the publication of volume 25. It's just not the case. So, Dr. Jackson, I know there are a few trace references of posterior arch adjusting after 1950. Would you just please kindly go over those one or two references that BJ does mention?
Yeah, so there are some references. It's there's never a time where it says BJ did that. There's things that come out of, for example, like BJ Palmer Chiropractic Clinic adjacent publications. So one would be the Spinograph Research Department of the BJ Palmer Chiropractic Clinic, for example, has written something like that. So let me give you that quote then. Let me find that one. Here we go. In the ICA review from May 1953, there's an article from the Spinograph Research Department of the BJ Palmer Chiropractic Clinic. It's concerning AP cervical spinograph problems. That's the title of the paper. One abnormality they highlight is where the condyles are positioned so that they noticeably face more anteriorly. It then goes on to state in that article, under these circumstances, posterior arch of atlas is considered as a possible contact point if atlas adjustment is necessary. That's page 28. One other reference would be, again, in the ICA review of March 1955, is from the Public Interest Department of the BJ Palmer Chiropractic Clinic, and it's titled Regional Congenital Abnormalities. It shows a spinograph and it states, the left transverse of atlas is too high in relation to mastoid for contact. So contact on this side of atlas would have to be on the posterior arch. This structure is heavy enough for contact in this case. On the right side, transverse of atlas is low enough for contact should the laterality be in this direction. That's page 3. So, in both those instances, they're sort of saying in these fringe cases, maybe there's an argument that we can't get to the transverse, so we'll do posterior arch. There's also one more in specific spinal analysis and adjusting techniques, which was put out by the PSC in 1953. It's like a real nice, like leather cover, page spiral book. It's real nice. I wish I had one actually. It's under contacts. It says the contacts used for specific upper cervical work are briefly atlas transverse and on some occasions atlas posterior arch. Axis, spinous, laminar, or body, and that's page 49 and 50. So again, it seems to be saying that, okay, occasionally we might use the posterior arch, but again, at no point is it BJ saying that that's what he does. It's coming from sort of BJ Palmer Chiropractic Clinic adjacent publications.
So as we saw there, Dr. Jackson, it was a rare occurrence, or very uncommon at least, where the posterior arch was used as a contact point when adjusting atlas. From what we saw in the writing over there, it was done predominantly for these rare occurrences of just severely malformed upper cervical areas that required a different contact point because the transverse process was just not anatomically available. So a lot of people will still point back to that and say, well, see, BJ Palmer adjusted on the posterior arch, so that's why we do it today. Well, if you believe that that's the case, that BJ Palmer did adjust on the posterior arch as the predominant contact point, you're also likely to believe that BJ Palmer went back to adjusting full spine in the mid-1950s. Now, let's break that down for those who have never heard that before. In the mid-1950s, when the Palmer-Thompson adjustment technique was coming out, BJ Palmer did return to full spine adjusting. However, here's the criteria for that. Full spine neurocolometer scans were performed on patients, and the upper cervical area had to be clear of interference and pressure for at least 2 weeks prior to having a lower spinal segment considered for adjustment. Now, when that lower spinal segment was considered for adjustment, the qualifiers were the following two. One is it had to have a constant neurocolometer break pattern at that segment. And then secondarily, the chiropractor was advised to take an x-ray of that area to determine the specific listing for that segment. Now, how often did this occur? Research shows in volume 35, History in the Making, that BJ Palmer did adjust a full spine, however, only in 1.8% of the cases studied. So did BJ Palmer adjust the posterior arch? Dr. Jackson, would you kindly wrap us up with a quote from D.D. Palmer?
Sure. So in his 1910 book, he eloquently states, "It is not only a pleasure, but a duty to correct mistakes as fast as they are known to us. We are not above making mistakes." I think, we just want to say, if we are proven at any point that we are incorrect, then we're more than willing to, relook at the evidence that we're presented and change based on the new information that we get.
Absolutely. And that's really what chiropractic has been about from 1895 until today. As BJ Palmer so eloquently puts it, our purpose is to eliminate variables and establish constants and drive forward the science of chiropractic. Dr. Jackson, thank you once again for joining us and filling us in with your detailed historical references. As always, much appreciated.
Thank you.